At this point, I'm sure you all have witnessed the progressive infighting online that started on Twitter and has since spilled over onto YouTube. Just in case you haven't, let me give you a quick rundown. Jimmy Dore is demanding that progressives in Congress, the squad in particular, withhold their vote for Nancy Pelosi's speakership unless she gives them a floor vote on Medicare for All. AOC and company don't seem to think it will work, and will likely vote for Pelosi when the new Congress is sworn in. This has led to infighting on the online left between those who think the strategy won't work, or that it's unfair to call the people sellouts for not pursuing this strategy. The Young Turks and the Majority Report are in that camp, and those that think it's incredibly obvious that it will. Jimmy Dore is the leader of this faction. The funny thing about this is, everyone knows that the Medicare for All vote is symbolic. It's not going to pass the House of Representatives. Even if it did, it wouldn't pass the Senate. And even if it did somehow pass the Senate, neither Donald Trump nor Joe Biden would sign it. And everyone knows this. The idea behind #ForceTheVote is that those who oppose it will be on record having done so. And in 15 months from now, when the first primaries are held, or 23 months from now, when the next congressional elections are held, the people will see who stood between them and their government healthcare and punish them at the ballot box. And then with our brand new Congress, we will have Medicare for All for real.
And the only time that the progressives in Congress are going to have any power is right now, at this moment, to withhold their vote from Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi's speakership is not more important than a basic human right. So I heard people say, well, they might be committing career suicide if they do that. What is really? You know what's career suicide? Not fighting for Medicare for All in the middle of a deadly pandemic. Fighting for people's health care is how you get reelected. Not fighting for it is how Joe Crowley lost. That's how you get elected. The people, Nancy Pelosi doesn't hire and fire Congress people. It's the people in your district. And if they see you fighting against the power for them, for health care in the middle of a deadly pandemic, you're going to get reelected.
To say that this is a bank shot strategy is to say the least of it. There are a number of problems with this plan that others have talked about, so I won't bother going over most of it. But it's worth noting that because it won't pass, because it's just a symbolic vote, the floor vote wouldn't even be a reliable measure of who is actually for it. In other words, Jimmy Dore is a fool for thinking this would somehow be more reliable than the current co-sponsor list. Representatives and senators play politics with votes all the time when they already know what the outcome will be. The best example of this is the debt ceiling. A number of politicians, including Congressman Joe Scarborough in the 1990s and Senator Barack Obama, voted no on raising the debt ceiling and engaged in finger-waving about how the government spends too much money. During the debt ceiling fight of 2011, when people called them out on their hypocrisy, they responded that they only voted no because they knew it was going to pass anyways.
What I can tell you, Ben, is that the president, as David Plouffe said yesterday, regrets that vote and thinks it was a mistake. He realizes now that raising the debt ceiling is so important to the health of this economy and the global economy that it is not a vote that even when you are protesting an administration's policies, you can play around with. And you need to take very seriously the need to raise the debt limit so that the full faith and credit of the United States government is maintained around the globe.
In other words, they could afford to grandstand because the outcome was already known in advance. If that wasn't the case, they likely would have voted differently. We also see this same thing happening with the negotiations over the stimulus checks.
They don't want to vote for these checks. They don't really want these checks either. They want a face-saving gesture that doesn't destroy their political ambitions. And so that's effectively what McConnell decided to do here. He came up with this clever maneuver of, I'm going to put together the $2,000 checks with Section 230 repeal and this election fraud commission thing, knowing that Democrats wouldn't go along with those things, called a poison pill. So he engineered its failure, but provides the face saving for his vulnerable senators in Georgia, or at least that's what he thinks he's doing.
If a congressman knew that he or she could vote yes on Medicare for All to ward off a primary challenge, then they may do so to protect themselves. That doesn't mean they would actually vote in favor of the bill if it were truly on the line. But what about the online leftist infighting? Some of you have asked me to make a video about this, and I'm flattered. The thing is, though, I already kind of did. In 2019, I made a video called Why Progressives Eat Their Own, where I laid out the basic logic behind why people who ostensibly agree on most things tear each other apart. Most people in the online left think that their solutions to our various problems are easy, obvious, and without serious trade-offs, both politically and practically. Therefore, there are no good reasons to oppose these policy ideas. So the people who do so must be operating based on ulterior motives. They must be sellouts. In the specific case of Medicare for All, we all just know that it's going to deliver better healthcare for everyone and cost less on the whole. And as an added bonus, it polls super well. Just about everyone wants it. So it's a policy win and a political win. The only reason anyone would ever oppose it is because they're corrupt themselves, or they're the useful idiot for someone who is corrupt.
We know what the right policy is, but and last thing, Democrats, you go Medicare for all. It's a no-brainer, and it's supposed to be a progressive position. The overwhelming majority of Democrats are still like, oh, that's impractical. That's a Republican talking point. Why are you saying that? It's because you're corrupt. You take donor money. Anyone who's not for Medicare for all, who's a Democrat, flat out corrupt. Period. Period.
The reason why Jimmy Dore has gotten so much traction on this, and the reason why so many online leftists are siding with him, and the reason why those who don't are really in a bind, is because almost all of them accept the premises that I laid out. Hashtag force the vote is in many ways the logical outcome of this sort of thinking. There are many problems with this line of reasoning, though. The first of which is, if there's as much demand for Medicare for all as progressives say there is, why don't politicians already feel the pressure to pass it? Well, many progressives would probably say that this is why you need a very public strategy like force the vote, because even though Medicare for all is popular, there's a disconnect within the electorate about the policy and which politicians are for it.
The case that is being made is that, I will speak for myself, is that there is a disconnect between what voters want and what politicians are willing to fight for, Democratic politicians. And the reason why Democratic politicians don't suffer as a consequence of not doing what their constituents want is because the media is complicit. They never highlight that gap. People don't even know that a majority of, or about half of Democrats in the House don't even support Medicare for all. They don't believe that Medicare for all is as popular as it is because nobody ever popularizes the statistic that almost 90% of Democrats are on board and nearly 50% of Republicans are on board. And everyone is able to hide behind the idea that they can't back this thing because it would be electoral kryptonite.
There is a disconnect, all right, but it's not between the voters and the politicians, though. The disconnect is between progressive activists and the public. Contrary to what you may have heard from the online left, the voting public is not with them on the majority of issues. The left believes that the polls show this to be true. This is the linchpin of so many of their arguments, which is unfortunate for them because it's intellectually bankrupt. First of all, the actual results of polls are frequently misunderstood. Medicare for All is actually a great example of this. While Medicare for All does tend to register very high approval numbers, most people actually think it's referring to a public option, not single-payer healthcare. My friend Sean over at the channel Actual Justice Warrior has argued this case persuasively.
As we've talked about multiple times, despite the fact that the top-line poll numbers will indicate that the American people do support Medicare for All, whenever you delve into the specific polling on specific features of a Medicare for All program, it turns out that what people are actually saying they're in favor of is the public option, not Medicare for All as it's known to people who actually understand policy. You can look at the polling, I will link it in the description box below, but even among the Democrats, they are not in favor of Medicare for All. They much preferred Joe Biden's healthcare plan, which is to build on Obamacare and add a public option, to Bernie's Medicare for All plan.
So there's no need for me to go over that. But if you're curious, I suggest you watch his video on it. Link is in the description box below. Even if the polls did show people unambiguously supported exactly the single-payer system that Bernie Sanders and company advocate for, our friends on the left would still be on the outside looking in. In this video, I want to talk about a concept from economics known as revealed preference theory. Developed by the economist Paul Samuelson, revealed preference theory postulates a way of discerning consumer preferences based on people's observed choices. According to Wikipedia, revealed preference is a way to infer the preferences of individuals given the observed choices. It contrasts with attempts to directly measure preferences or utility, for example, through stated preferences. Taking economics to be an empirical subject, there is the issue that one cannot observe preferences. In other words, according to the advocates of revealed preference theory, it is not what you say, it is what you do that reveals what you want. The last part is key here. The basic idea is that people tell you way more about themselves through their behavior than they do through their words. Let's look at some real-life examples of this and talk about its political applications. In the late 90s and early 2000s, traditional newspapers faced increased competition from online news outlets. In response to this, newspaper companies started doing two things. They started conducting surveys with their readership about what content they wanted more of in hopes that they could better serve these people and keep them as customers. They also started posting more and more of their content online, in hopes of keeping up with their digital competitors. The results of the surveys were pretty consistent. Across the board, people would tell newspaper companies they wanted more foreign news, more in-depth investigative reporting, and more cultural news. With the online content, though, the newspaper companies were actually able to get reliable metrics of what stories got the most clicks. The most consistently read sections were the letters to the editor, sports scores, and, weirdly, obituaries. So, in other words, people were telling the companies that they wanted something entirely different from what they actually read. A similar thing happens with how people like their steak cooked. Walt Hickey at 538 has an odd fascination with this question. In 2014, he partnered with SurveyMonkey to find out how Americans liked their steak. A plurality, 38%, said they liked it medium rare. Second place was medium with 31%. Just this year, though, Longhorn Steakhouse reached out to 538 with their numbers of how Americans who ate at their restaurant actually liked their steak. The results were clear. Americans liked their steak more thoroughly cooked than they were willing to say. A plurality, 37.5% of Longhorn Steakhouse's customers, liked their steak cooked medium. Medium well comes in second at 25.8%. Hickey suspects that this is due to the fact that well-cooked steak is seen as lowbrow. See the mockery of President Trump over his well-done steaks with ketchup on them, whereas all the steak snobs insist that rare is how steaks should be cooked. There are countless examples of this. These just happen to be two of my favorites. But why is there so frequently this divorce between what people say and what they actually want? And what does this have to do with politics? When it comes to surveys and opinion polls, people are oftentimes embarrassed by what they actually want and will frequently give answers that they think other people want to hear. Or they may not have thought through the actual question they're being asked, or they may not even know what they want until they're actually offered it. Regardless of the reasons why, people's stated preferences are usually not reliable predictors of their actual behavior. If you assume that revealed preference theory is correct, that there's consistently going to be significant difference between what people say they want and what they really want, then the political ramifications should be obvious. Progressives constantly bang their heads against the wall, trying to reconcile the fact that their issues poll really well, but that they don't usually win races. They invoke conspiracy and bias and sabotage to explain away their minority status in politics. But the answer is far simpler. Just because people say they want a certain policy in the abstract doesn't mean they're going to vote in a certain way. In fact, you're likely to have a bigger difference between what people say they want and how they vote, because you're not even comparing like with like. With the exception of direct ballot initiatives, you're usually voting for a person, not a specific policy. At best, this person may be a stand-in for a set of policies, but they're usually viewed as a person. Our boy Kyle very nearly stumbled upon this insight when talking about the potential 2024 presidential Democratic candidates.
Maybe Michelle Obama would be marginally better than Harris, but I'm basing that on nothing at all, right? Like, I don't know her actual policy beliefs, which should be the main thing, but somehow she's leading when nobody knows her policy beliefs. Nobody knows them. They just like her as a person. And it's like, well, that's why I want her. Oh my God, then are we really any different than how the Republicans act? They just fell in love with, like, the persona that is Donald Trump, like, you know, big capitalism boss man who screams at everybody, and they're like, yes, out alpha me, daddy, yes. Like, that's what they looked at. It was the Trumpiness about him that they fell in love with. If Michelle Obama's leading, it's the Michelle Obama-ness that people are falling in love with. It's personal. It's not policy.
Voters are not these rational calculators of information. Most voters, with few notable exceptions, don't think about policies when casting their ballots. Instead, certain qualities that people tend to like in other people tend to be rewarded. Most people are relatively disinterested in politics and delegate their power to people they like and trust. As the political scientists John R. Hibbing and Elizabeth Thies Morse write in their book Stealth Democracy, the last thing people want is to be more involved in political decision-making. They do not want to make political decisions themselves. They do not want to provide much input to those who are assigned to make these decisions. And they would rather not know all the details of the decision-making process. Most people have strong feelings on few, if any, issues the government needs to address and would much prefer to spend their time in non-political pursuits. Most people are simply not engaged in the political process for a strategy like Jimmy Dore's to work. There is consistently a divorce between what people say they want out of politics and the actual effort they're willing to put in at the ballot box. Think about how poorly Congress as a whole usually polls. It's normally just slightly north of single digits. Yet most people in Congress get reelected. There's typically more turnover in a given election cycle as a result of retirements than there are as a result of primary losses or flipped seats. If you assume that revealed preference theory is true, there's nothing that really needs to be explained here. People may not like Congress as an institution, but they think their own representative is just fine. Maybe people would like the other guy in the primary or the general election better, but voters typically don't feel the need to put in the research to figure that out. So even if people tell a pollster they like the idea of Medicare for all, that doesn't mean they're going to get all excited and take to the streets and go through the effort of calling their representatives or even vote in line with that opinion.
I hate it when people say, "Oh, it's performative or it's symbolic." Like, no, not really. Like, soon as we know we're going to have that vote, do you have any idea the pressure that's going to be exerted on Washington, D.C., how many people you can get in the street, how many phone calls you can make to every single congressperson's office, where you convince them that if you don't do this, you're going to lose your reelection. There's no doubt about it.
This is a fantasy. I do hope the Justice Democrats do what he says, though. I want Jimmy to be the dog that caught the car. Even if Democrats do take a vote on Medicare for all, it's unlikely to move the needle in a direction progressives hope. The electorate just isn't that into it.